introduce yourself to the jury.
My name is Shepard, Dr. Derek Shepard.
What do you do for a living?
I'm an emergency medicine doctor.
What current positions do you hold?
I am currently the medical director of emergency medicine at Methodist Hospital. I'm also a assistant professor of emergency medicine at Lone Star Medical College.
What previous positions have you held?
I've been the director of emergency services in Denver, Colorado, clinical instructor for Lone Star Medicine for School of Medicine.
What, if any, certifications do you have?
I'm certified by the American Board of Emergency Medicine.
Where did you go to medical school?
I went to medical school at Lone Star University.
Where did you get your undergraduate degree?
Tulane University, New Orleans.
What, if any, professional appointments have you held?
I'm currently the chair of the Lone Star Medical Center Disaster Relief Committee, or Disaster Committee. I've also been physician to Pope John Paul II on his papal visits in Denver, Colorado, as well as various other appointments with Red Cross and others.
And do you believe that you have adequate training and experience in the field of emergency medicine?
I do. I have been following my residency in 1997 in emergency medicine. I've been practicing emergency medicine for a long time.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention to today's case. Who are you treating on June 14th, 2014?
I believe her last name is Miss Testa.
And after seeing Ms. Testa and examining her at the ER, did you have sufficient facts and data to form a conclusion about her injuries that night?
I did, yes, ma'am.
And what, if any, documents did you review in anticipation for today's trial?
All of the encompassing documents with her medical records.
Did that supply you with enough information to be able to form a conclusion today?
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, at this time, the state offers Dr. Derek Shepard as an expert in the field of emergency medicine.
What says the defense? Any voir dire?
No, Your Honor, but I do object to this witness being entered as an expert. This is a fact witness, as he was the doctor who saw Ms. Testa on the night in question, and there's no medical evidence to back up his conclusion. So by offering him as an expert, the jury would give his testimony improper weight.
What about it, Ms. Brady?
Your Honor, we've laid plenty of foundation pursuant to Rule 702 that he uses the proper principles in this field, that he has plenty of experience to be able to form a conclusion. He explained that he reviewed documents and was able to come to a conclusion in this case. It would be proper for him to be...
Conclusion about what?
As to her injuries, what they were not consistent with the severity of those injuries. All of that is necessary for our elements
How
of
does
case.
he need to be why does he need to be qualified as an expert in order to testify as to what he observed on that night?
It goes beyond just what he observed. His conclusions about the severity of those injuries would be probative for the jury to understand and give weight to that.
The severity of the injury kind of speaks for itself based upon whatever he's going to testify as to what he saw. How does he have to be an expert to describe what it was that he saw and treated that night?
It goes beyond just what he saw. A conclusion as to it being a fracture. Only a medical doctor could testify whether or not the injuries, when he looked at them, appeared to be fractures. Therefore, that would be necessary for one of our elements of a severe injury. Pursuant to the jury instructions, it explains how fractures could fall under that category.
Is he offering his opinion about whether or not it was a fracture or not, or is he just merely going to state that it was or it was not a fracture?
It's his opinion that it was a fracture. And he also offers opinions to the consistency of the size and shapes of the wounds with a household hammer, which Ms. Testa testified was used on her that night. So that would also be an opinion that a medical expert would have to make.
What about Ms. Kluska?
Your Honor, what the counsel for the prosecution just said was that he would testify as to his conclusions based on the facts, and those conclusions that he came to don't have any medical evidence to back it up. We already heard Ms. Testa's testimony, and that alone should be enough for the jury to understand that her injuries were serious and perhaps how she obtained them, but the doctor doesn't need to testify as to those conclusions, as it would give the jury improper weight to his testimony.
All right, the objection is sustained at this time. If there was some opinion upon which you sought to offer from Dr. Shepard regarding what he may have thought occurred and led to these injuries of some kind, then that would be one thing. But if you're merely seeking to introduce what his observations are about the nature of the injuries, then we'll limit him as a fact witness at this time.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Dr. Shepard, you mentioned that you treated Adriana Testa on June 14th, 2014. What condition was she in when she arrived at your hospital?
When she arrived at the hospital, she had multiple injuries to the front and back of her skull. She was in a very excited state as well, with some abrasions and lacerations to her lower extremities and her hands as well.
Now, where did you say the wounds were located?
She had multiple wounds to the anterior part of her skull, a single wound to the posterior part of her skull, and lacerations and abrasions on her palms as well as her shins and knees.
And what did she inform you about the circumstances surrounding this incident?
She informed me that she was hit in the head and that she ran for quite a while.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Your Honor, these are statements for the purpose of medical diagnosis. The fact that she was running and fell, that is to explain the consistency with the scrapes, and that she was hit in the head with a hammer explains the wounds to the skull.
Objection is overruled. Next.
Doctor, could you please explain to the jury what the circumstances surrounding the incident were?
Sure. She informed me that she had been hit in the head and then fell while running, sustaining those lacerations and abrasions to her knees and hands.
Now, the conditions as you observed them, how consistent were those with the circumstances she explained to you?
They were consistent.
And I'd like to also talk about Miss Adriana's condition when she arrived. Have you treated intoxicated patients in the past?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am.
And how common is it for you to determine the signs of intoxication?
Very common.
What, if any, indication did Adriana give you that she was intoxicated that night?
None whatsoever.
What, if any, prescriptions did she have?
She had a prescription for an oral contraceptive as well as Xanax.
And what, if anything, made you think that she was intoxicated on this Xanax?
Nothing. Nothing.
And what, if any, drugs or alcohol did you find in her system?
Our reports came back negative for drugs.
What, if any intoxicated signs did she show at all that day? When she saw you?
She showed no intoxicated signs. She came in and she was very excited. Looked like someone that had been in a traumatic situation. But other than that, her blood pressure, her pulse, oxygen saturation levels were all normal.
Now, what was your plan to treat Miss Testa?
Our plan was to have her stay overnight and be monitored.
How did that turn out?
Well, we're not able to force people to stay for overnight. Sort of watching or what have you. So she actually left on her own accord.
Now, before she left, were you able to run any tests on her skull where you said those injuries were?
There was a CT scan that was run, yes, ma'am.
What does a CT scan do?
Just scans for fractures.
How accurate are these types of tests?
They're relatively accurate when read well, or read correctly, I should say.
And what documents did you review related to the CT scan?
I guess it's the final report or the medical report from the CT scan itself.
And what were the results of that CT scan based on his findings?
Just that it showed that she'd been hit in the head. There were no evidence of stroke or tumor or hemorrhage or anything like that, but that it was consistent with contusions to her skull.
What did you determine about the CT scan?
I determined that it was inconsistent with what I saw and what I ascertained from my evaluation of her. That I personally saw fractures from the depth and severity of the trauma to her head. The CT scan did not reveal that, but based on my assessment of Ms. Testa, I saw what I consider to be fractures.
Now, in your 20 years of experience, how common is it for you to identify fractures?
As an emergency medical doctor, very common.
Now, what instrument did the fractures appear to be consistent with?
Appeared to be consistent with a hand.
And how did the size and shape compare to a household hammer?
They would have been very consistent with a household hammer.
Your Honor, at this time I ask to publish Exhibit 4, an enlarged version to the jury.
An enlarged version of what?
Exhibit 4, the household hammer.
Any objection?
No objection.
Now, Dr. Shepard, this hammer, would you consider this to be a household hammer?
Yes, ma'am, I would.
So how would this hammer compare to the wounds that you observed on Adriana Testa that night?
They would be very similar. Very similar.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Shepard.
Afternoon.
I would like to begin by talking a little bit about the curriculum vitae that you provided to the court today.
Yes, ma'am.
You provided a curriculum vitae, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that those are like professional resumes.
Yes, ma'am.
So it lists your professional history,
Yes.
and you're a doctor,
Yes.
a medical school graduate.
Yes, ma'am.
And now you're even the medical director of emergency medicine at a Methodist hospital, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And one of your previous positions on that is the assistant medical director in Denver, correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
But you nicknamed that position the Knife and Gun Club on your professional document, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And you were the physician for a boxing event.
Yes, ma'am, that's
You were
correct.
you were the physician for a football team.
Yes, ma'am, the Lone Star Cowboys.
Yeah, so you would agree with me that boxing and football commonly cause head injuries, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you're very well versed in what it means to have a head injury, right?
I like to think so, yes.
So going back to your professional document, you listed on there that your email is mcdreamy@graysanatomy.com, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And your marital status as well, right?
Yes.
And you listed that your marital status is very single.
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And in your report that you created about Miss Testa that night, you described her as well developed, didn't you?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Moving on a little bit more to that report that you created for Miss Testa that night, you were the emergency room doctor on June 14th, correct?
Yes.
Miss Testa came into the emergency room
Yes.
and you treated her.
Yes.
And she came in and you tested her with a tox screen, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And she actually tested positive for alcohol, didn't she?
Yes, ma'am, there was alcohol in her system.
And she tested positive for Xanax, right?
Yes, ma'am, she did. She's prescribed Xanax.
But regardless of whether she's prescribed it or when she said she took it, she tested positive for both alcohol and Xanax on the night in question, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And she also told you that she may be bipolar, right?
She did, but she'd never been diagnosed. It was self-diagnosis. Patients come in all the time and self-diagnose with any number of diseases.
But that's what she told you, right?
She did, yes, ma'am.
And she came in, she had scrapes on her hands
Yes.
and scrapes on her knees.
Yes.
So you would agree with me that scrapes on your hands and knees are consistent with her story of falling, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And she also had wounds on her head.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that those could have been caused possibly by falling as well, right?
They could have, but not to the severity that her wounds were, or that her wounds appeared on her skull.
Well, it's your opinion that Miss Testa was suffering from 2 skull fractures, right?
Yes, ma'am.
But there's no x-ray that says she was suffering from skull fractures, is there?
No, the CT scan did come back positive for fractures.
No, it did not.
Or negative for fractures. Pardon me. Misspoke.
There's no CT scan that said she was suffering from fractures, is there?
That's correct.
So there is literally no medical evidence outside of your words that agrees with your opinion that Miss Testa was suffering from a skull fracture, is there?
Other than my treatment or my diagnosis no, ma'am, there is not.
And there's actually a CT scan that says the exact opposite, isn't there?
Correct.
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
Overruled.
Correct, but I believe, as I previously stated, they can be misread.
But the diagnosis on that was normal, whether or not it was misread, correct?
Well, normal. It was that there were no fractures.
Correct.
It still showed that she had severe wounds to the front and back of her skull.
Show me in that CT scan where it says there were severe wounds to the front and back of her skull.
It says no evidence of fracture present.
And it doesn't mention any other wounds, does it?
No, ma'am.
Nothing further.
Redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, opposing counsel came and asked you if the injuries could be consistent with falling. Now, the injuries, could they also be consistent with being hit and falling onto the ground as a result?
Yes, ma'am, and that's what they appear to be.
And she also talked a bit about a toxicology screen and Xanax being in the system. Can Xanax and trace amounts still be in the system after a delayed period of time?
Absolutely.
And did that tox screen show that she actually took Xanax that night?
No, it did not.
How severe would you classify the injuries that Ms. Testa suffered from?
Very severe. As I've stated before, they appear to me to be fractures, which is a very serious injury.
What types of risks are associated with being hit in the head with a hammer?
Depending upon the severity, they can be absolutely be life-threatening, with hemorrhaging to the brain, loss of consciousness, things like that.
So even without a fracture, how would you classify this type of injury?
Absolutely, they could be life-threatening.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.